Thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you today who are participating in the conference. And my name is Andrea Basche, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture at the University of Nebraska. I wanted to share with you a few big picture ideas around climate risks as well as opportunities. And when we talk about climate change and the future, I think it's important for us to remember that we're already experiencing many of these things that are projected to increase in intensity. And so we're already living in the future, right? So what did we experience in Nebraska just in the last 2 years in terms of water, right? We had catastrophic floodings that did a lot of damage to farms, ranches, communities in 2019. And now we're experiencing drought conditions. 100% of Nebraska abnormally dry or drought conditions. Across the plains, we're seeing drought conditions grow in intensity and coverage. So what I'm showing you here is a recent image from the drought monitor and showing nearly 100% of the plains in abnormally dry or drought conditions. So the future that we are anticipating in terms of more variability is already upon us. I want to also, just in framing this conversation, share with you some of the highlights from the National Climate Assessment, which the last National Climate Assessment was put out in 2018. I participated in a session in 2019 with the state climatologist, Martha Shulsky, and I wanted to just give you a high-level sense of some of the impacts that we might expect in Nebraska in the climate future, and then think about how we might use that information to design our crop management, cropping systems. So the next several graphs that I'm going to show you represent the difference in climate model projections from the mid-20th century that are projected from the actual climate between 1976 and 2005. And so these are actually for a lower carbon emissions pathway than actually the scenario that we're on. So the reports that you may be familiar with that come out from the government and intergovernmental panels will use these different carbon scenarios to represent the different pathways that we might follow into the future. And so this is actually a lower scenario than the trajectory we're already on. So just keep that in mind. So from this projection, temperatures are expected to be several degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they already are now. So that's one thing just in terms of temperature. We can also expect the number of very warm days to increase. We can also expect the number of very cold days to decrease, which of course, when we think about these things, when we think about the critical periods of temperature thresholds for our field crops, this is scary, right? This is a huge risk that we could be thinking about in terms of higher number of very hot days and a lower number of very cold days. We know there's some crops that need that cold weather to move through their developmental stages, right? What else can we expect? Maybe on a more positive note, we can expect a longer growing season, actually by several weeks, and possibly an increase of growing degree days by 25%. So that could potentially be a positive. And then in terms of rainfall, we're expected in this part of the U.S. to see slightly more rainfall on average, which could be a little deceiving. The important piece to focus on here is the second bullet point on the slide, that it's anticipated there will be a shift in the timing and frequency of rain events. And so, as I've already started, we're experiencing that between 2019, 2020, 2021. Very heavy rain and then drought conditions. So the future is already here. And essentially, in terms of the seasonal shift, we're expected to see more rain in the winter, spring, and fall, and less in the summer. Okay, so that's important when we think about the major field crops that we grow in Nebraska. Most of those crops are summer annual crops, so they're predominantly growing and using water in the summer months. So if there's less water then and more in other seasons when the soil's usually bare, that's something that we want to think about in terms of reducing risk and potentially taking advantage of opportunities. And so I just want to remind everyone again that these are projections. So they are anticipated based on the best available science that we have. They're also consistent with recent observations that we have been experiencing. So again, we're already living parts of what the future might look like. And I like this summary that they presented at this conference because it shows many of the potential effects and impacts in terms of climate that could have a really big impact on agriculture. So things like longer growing season, warmer summers, more extreme hot days, wetter springs, etc. And so I know that this looks like a lot of challenges. I want to shift and talk a little bit about some of the opportunities. If we think about things like a longer growing season, a wetter spring, of course, impacts like increased runoff and soil erosion. What are things that we can do to take advantage of those different impacts, right? One thing we can do, and one thing that I admittedly am really supportive of, I've done a lot of research in this area, is to grow more crops over the winter because that will help us conserve our soil. That is when we are anticipated to be experiencing more shifting rainfall. So if we had more crops over winter, that would, help us take advantage of a longer growing season, wetter springs, and do more soil conservation. And so that's just one idea where I could see a lot of benefits of having more continuous living cover on our landscapes, whether that's winter annual crops, cover crops, forage crops, just more continuous roots in the soil could be one potential opportunity to take advantage of some of these impacts that we see. And another resource I might mention to you to start thinking about ways you can take advantage of some of these opportunities is a great website and resource that was put together by UNL Extension called Weather Ready Farms. So it's a platform that was developed based on extensive user input to help plan for different seasons and different impacts. So here I'm just showing the spring and cold and wet potential conditions. And what they're showing here is that with fewer field days, there are some different approaches that you might take in terms of shifting crop varieties to shorter season to account for maybe more difficult spring planting conditions. So they've got a lot of different scenarios in terms of seasons and weather that you might look at. And I just think this is a nice resource to think about weather variability really in the time scale that farmers are making decisions, which is, in the short term, not for 2060, not right now at least. And I encourage you also to think about this concept of adaptive capacity. It's something I talk to my undergraduate students about because I think it kind of just brings down to earth some of the concepts when we think about climate. So what is adaptive capacity? It's the ability of a farm to respond to challenges and to take advantage of opportunities. I think the important thing here that I want to leave you with is that, adaptive capacity has to do with all of these things that you see above the adaptive capacity bar there. It's your operating context, it's your knowledge and options, it's your individual capacity. So there are real limits imposed by your locality, your ecology, your social and economic realities, your larger community, right? That there is only so much you might be able to do. It's limited in terms of your adaptive ability based on operating context and your knowledge. But what I want to encourage you to think about is that, there can be ways that you might start thinking about growing or shifting an operation to take more advantage of changes. And I would like to think that in the environment that we're living in with the pandemic, that you're already starting to think about some of those shifts. So what are some of the farm practices, finances, infrastructure, programs? How can you increase your knowledge so that you are more flexible? You might not be able to impact the operating context with which you're operating within, but there are other ways that you might consider to start shifting your farm and hopefully ultimately community to be more flexible to manage some of these future risks. And I'll just leave it there for you. Hopefully these are a few things to just set the scene and think about in terms of future climate. I would remind us that the future is already here. We're already managing and dealing with a lot of these unforeseen and challenging issues. And I would say, just as one opportunity, as we see a shift in seasonal rainfall, that could be a way for us to take advantage of a longer growing season and conserve soil by having more continuous roots living on the landscape. And finally, just continue to encourage you to think about ways that you can improve your own flexibility, your own adaptive capacity on your farm to not just manage risk, but also take advantage of the opportunities that come with change. Thanks so much.